So welcome everyone to today's plenary session. I'm Sybil Sightsinger, the Executive Director of the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, and coming to you from Victoria, British Columbia. And I would like to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, which is where I am located, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wisanic peoples whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. So welcome everyone. I'm going to be introducing our plenary speaker, Dr. Karen Kohfeld. But before I do that, I'd like to remind everyone to enter any questions that you have as the talk goes along into the chat, or no, sorry, into the Q&A, please. You can also enter into the chat, but please use the Q&A if possible. And at the end, there'll be time for your questions, which I will read out to Karen so that she can address them. So thank you all for attending. And I'd like to introduce now Dr. Karen Kohfeld, who is professor at Simon Fraser University and the former Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Climate, Resources, and Global Change in the School of Resources and Environmental Management and the School of Environmental Science. Quite a mouthful there, Karen. Internationally, Karen is well known for her work on past climate and the global carbon cycle, specifically using global data sets to understand the roles of atmospheric dust, ocean productivity, and ocean circulation in modulating long-term changes in climate and the global carbon cycle. In 2006, Karen formed the Climate, Oceans, and Paleoenvironments Laboratory at SFU, where she's now focusing there on regional changes in climate and the carbon cycle. She has numerous collaborators, including with Metro Vancouver, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and Parks Canada, as well as a wide range of academic collaborators and students. Her students are involved with her in research on changes in ocean acidification, the 5,000-year history of fire behavior in Western Canada, and understanding carbon storage dynamics in coastal wetlands and lacustrine environments, which I think she's going to talk to us much more today about. Karen is a member of the Canadian Council of Academies panel on Canada's carbon sink potential. And this year, she received an honorary PhD degree from Stockholm University, where she also serves on the external advisory group for the Berlin Center for Climate Research. Today, she's going to talk about the importance of evidence-based approaches to understanding blue carbon dynamics along the Pacific coast of Canada. So over to you, Karen.
Thank you so much, Sybil, for that introduction. And thank you very much, Francis, for the invitation to give this presentation about understanding blue carbon dynamics on the Pacific coast of Canada. I've listed some of the co-authors. I've done this work with a lot of people, but my main collaborator in this work has been Marlo Palat from Parks Canada. And I'm going to be showing some of the unpublished work of one of my most recent master's students, Hassini Baznayake, and some unpublished work from Stephen Chastain as well. I really appreciate their incredibly hard work and contributions to this project. So Marlo Palat and I started working on this together about 6 years ago when we started collaborating with the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. And since then, the team of researchers with whom we've worked has exploded. We work with research scientists who help us with understanding our lead 210 dating on the sediments, some people who work on environmental law, other specialists who work on salt marshes on the East Coast, people who understand the ecology of seagrass beds, and people who are working with greenhouse gas fluxes, as well as GIS experts who are helping us to improve our mapping of these systems. We've had a whole suite of graduate students who have graduated with projects based on understanding blue carbon on the Pacific coast, and another new crop of students who are really fantastic that are working with us this summer in new areas. And we've also had a series of researchers, past and present, who have made incredible contributions to this work. I've listed many of our funders along here, and I'd like to mention that all of the research that I'm going to present to you today has been done on the traditional territories of the Nuu-chah-nulth and Coast Salish peoples. This includes the Huzik nations, the Semiahmoo nations, and the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And we're very grateful for the opportunity to be able to work in these areas. So why are we looking at this, at blue carbon to begin with? And I'd like to take a step back to considering Canada's commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement, and in fact, the global agreement, and for us to be approaching 2050 with net zero emissions. And under the Paris Agreement, Canada's committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 30% of 2005 levels by 2030, and net zero by 2050. And as you probably are all aware, this is a tremendously ambitious target for us globally and within Canada. So as part of this, the Canadian government has started to look at nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation. And again, this is something that's being explored at an international level, but I wanted to point out a few recent news releases showing the Government of Canada's commitments to this. They are increasing their natural protection ambition to address both climate change and biodiversity loss across the country. And as part of this, they want to conserve 25% of the land and ocean owned by Canada by 2025, and increase that to 30% of the land by 2030. They've also invested a lot of money, $200 million, to address climate change by restoring carbon-rich ecosystems through nature-based solutions. So one of the first things I want to do is give you an idea of what is meant by a nature-based climate solution. There are actually several different terms. There's nature-based solutions, natural climate solutions, and nature-based climate solutions, among others. And they all have slightly different nuances to them. So for the purposes of what I'm talking about today, I'm referring to the definition of actions that use natural systems to enhance climate mitigation and adaptation while providing co-benefits. And so these co-benefits, in addition to the blue carbon sequestration, include things like flood and storm protection, increasing biodiversity that helps with habitat for fish, birds, and wildlife. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm really going to be focusing on the blue carbon sequestration potential of these areas. So that leads to another definition that I'd like to talk about, which is what actually is blue carbon. And essentially, a blue carbon ecosystem is a tidal marsh, a tidal forested wetland, a mangrove forest, and seagrasses. And they're known to sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere continuously over thousands of years. And so they've been able to build up stocks of carbon in organic rich soils. And they're considered very effective at this relative to their land area. And so the idea is that if we know that a lot of these areas have been degraded or removed for development. So if we work on the restoration of these areas, or we conserve the areas we already have, these are proposed as potential nature-based climate solutions for sequestering, helping us to increase the sequestration or enhance the sequestration of carbon. Now, I'm going to put this number out there, but I've couched it in the term canonically, because we've canonically described blue carbon ecosystems as 0.5% of the seafloor, and that stores greater than 50% of the global ocean carbon burial. And I qualify it with canonically because throughout our work, it's become really quite clear that our knowledge of these systems is really great in some areas and poor in others. And if you just look at the global distribution of blue carbon ecosystems, one of the things you can see here is that the range of area is from 36 to 185 million hectares of area globally. So in other words, there is quite a bit of uncertainty in our knowledge about the areal extent of these ecosystems, as well as the amount of carbon that they store. However, this is becoming increasingly important. I'm putting up a slide here showing that the first blue carbon conservation methodology it has been put in place by the company Vera, which is a nonprofit organization that actually puts together international frameworks and standards to help finance things such as a voluntary carbon market. And so now that we've seen the first set of blue carbon conservation methodologies in place for coastal restoration and conservation, we're seeing an increasing interest in using these ecosystems for carbon sequestration as carbon sequestration mechanisms. But as you look into this in more detail, one of the things that we began to see more clearly is that there are a few issues with estimating blue carbon. If we look at the global assessments, there are regional biases in where the data are located. When Marla and I first started doing this, there were very few data for the entire Pacific coast of Canada. So there are large data gaps as well. There's spatial and temporal variability in the capacity for these ecosystems to store carbon, and our knowledge of the areal extent is actually quite poor. So that leads us to some of our goals within Canada. But first I want to point out how little actually was known about blue carbon in Canada. So we have in Canada a coastline of about 200,000 kilometers. And if we consider North America as a whole, we think that really only about 50% of those seagrass meadows are mapped for all of North America. And then when we consider just Canada, we're talking about 3% that's actually mapped. And a lot of this mapping is still very coarse at best. This particular figure right here is showing seagrass lines, so areas where we believe that seagrass is present, but we haven't actually mapped it so thoroughly. When we then go into the discussion of actually thinking about how much habitat is lost, we're starting with an uncertain number. So estimating that habitat loss becomes also very difficult to do. And then yes, and then we can extend this and think of the entire coastline. We know that there's a lot more that we need to know in terms of the presence of different blue carbon ecosystems. So our particular goals for the Pacific coast, has been to quantify blue carbon potential in certain areas where we have easy access. And we wanted to address the question of what are the carbon stocks and annual carbon accumulation rates, specifically for salt marshes and seagrass beds. How extensive are the areas of marshes and seagrass meadows in these areas? Have they changed in size over time? How variable are these systems starting within those systems? So for example, within the high versus the low marsh, do we see different blue carbon potential? Or within the seagrass beds, do we see different potential between the subtidal versus the intertidal zones of seagrass beds? And then also variability between coasts. Do we see different behavior on the east coast of Canada versus the west coast of Canada? Which gets us to our fourth point, which is how does carbon storage in the Pacific Coast blue carbon ecosystems compare with regional and global estimates? So I have put into squares three different regions in which we've worked. The first one is in Clayoquot Sound, where we've had several sites where we've looked at both seagrass beds and salt marsh areas. And the area of Boundary Bay, where we focused a lot of our work, especially during the pandemic when research in the parks was very, very difficult. So we decided to spend a lot of our time exploring the area in our backyard. And then our new research areas within the Gulf Islands. So I'm going to point out Boundary Bay here one more time, because it's got a particularly interesting component to it in that it's currently the site of proposed green infrastructure called the Boundary Bay Living Dike. And this is really quite interesting because the goal here is to use that existing marsh within Boundary Bay, enhance it, add sediments to it so that we can enhance protection against storm surges and flooding. And the ultimate goal is to protect for a sea level rise of up to 1 meter while minimizing ecological losses. And so the idea here is to actually go in and raise marsh areas that are just down sea from the built-in dike system along Boundary Bay in order to help with that protection. So at this point, there are test areas that are in place that have been designed in collaboration with the cities of Delta and the city of Surrey and the Semiahmoo Nation. So this would be an example more of a nature-based solution because no assessment of the carbon has actually really been associated with that project. However, we have gone in and done an assessment of that carbon prior to the input of any sort of implementation or additions of soils, hoping that we actually have some sort of baseline of information before that marsh is changed. So the goal here is to quantify blue carbon. And so I wanted to talk briefly about how it is that you can actually do this, because there are multiple components that we need to consider. The first one is we have been mapping them both by walking the extent of the marsh or the extent of the seagrass beds. And I've just got a note that my internet connection is unstable. Can people still hear me?
Yes, Karen, we can hear you. You did freeze for a second, but I think you're just fine. Keep going, please.
I could sort of hear you, so I will keep going.
Right.
Anyway, so we were looking at the aerial extent of these by walking them and using underwater cameras to map their extent, and then using aerial photographs and satellite images. Two other components that are important for quantifying blue carbon, and I'll touch on later, because this is part of our ongoing work, but not what we've been able to do at this point, is our understanding of the greenhouse gas fluxes between these ecosystems and the atmosphere. So in other words, measuring the amount of CO2 that's being taken up and emitted from the ecosystems, the methane and the nitrous oxide that's coming off of the marshes. And finally, the lateral exchange of the carbon sources. When you get into a Vera standard or any sort of actually policy regulation, you want to know what sort of additionality you're considering in these marsh areas. And so we want to try and get an estimate of what the terrestrial inputs are and what sort of lateral exchanges there are in and out of these coastal ecosystems. So again, I'm focusing first on the first two in this on this figure, the carbon stocks and accumulation rates and the aerial extent. So this has involved a considerable amount of field work over the past 6 years, where we've gone in and we've done vegetation surveys and mapping to understand the vegetation in each of them. We've established where the high marsh sits and where the low marsh elevation sits, using both vegetation and indicators of elevation. For seagrass, we've towed underwater cameras to map the inter and the subtidal seagrass extent, and also use some drone images in areas where we were allowed to use drones. And then in all cases, we've used percussion coring to extract the soil cores so that we have an ability to measure the carbon. We've taken depth profiles in some of the key marshes. That sounds actually a lot more complicated than it is. It's essentially taking a meter stick and hammering it down into the marsh until we reach a sand layer, which is at the base of the marsh. And then we use those to estimate the whole volume of those marshes so we can upscale the carbon content in them. And then as part of our movement into the future, we're looking at future analyses. We've been measuring the pore water salinity within the marshes so that we have an idea of essentially how much methagenesis do we think is actually taking place, and how might that vary on a seasonal cycle, especially within the marshes. So in estimating carbon, we get each one of these cores back and we measure the soil properties like the dry bulk density. We do extensive measurements of loss on ignition. And then we also measure the carbon and nitrogen using an elemental analyzer. And with that, we're able to extrapolate from our loss on ignition measurements to the percent of carbon in each of these cores. And then we use lead-210 dating to determine the carbon accumulation. In this case, over the past 80 to 110 years. These marshes are really quite young, and so I'll talk about that more in a minute. And so for measuring carbon stock and storage, we've done this a number of ways and tried to compare those methods to get an idea of the uncertainty that goes into it. But this is a basic idea of what we're doing. So we have our sediment core over here on the left, and part of what we do is for each centimeter interval, we're measuring the soil carbon density, which is the percent carbon multiplied by that dry bulk density. And then we're able to get the core carbon stock by adding up that carbon content down to what we are able to find is the depth of the peat layer. So the Pacific Coast marshes are really interesting in that while in some parts of the world, marshes can grow for a meter down to 4 to even 7 meters in some places. These marshes, we tend to hit the base of the peat layer below which we find sand at anywhere between about 20 centimeters to maximum 50 to 60 centimeters, very maximum. It's usually between 20 and 40 centimeters that we hit the base of this peat layer. And so what we're able to do then is to sum up, we have a layer that we believe is the depth of marsh initiation. And so we're able to sum up the carbon stock within these peat layers. And then because we have aerial estimates, we can then easily get at the marsh carbon storage just by multiplying that estimate of the carbon stock by the total marsh area. And for carbon accumulation rates, we're estimating the amount of carbon that's taken up or buried annually within the wetland soils. And we do this simply using lead-210 age models that on a select number of cores. And from that, we're able to estimate the number of grams per meter squared per year of storage in a particular sediment core, which we then can upscale to the whole marsh using the area of the marsh. So, and then finally, aerial extent is meadows or eelgrass meadows in this case, because we're trying to capture what's happening below the water surface. So through our underwater tows, this shows a map of where we had the subtidal and intertidal presence of seagrasses. I hope you can see this black area right down here. We've done walking of marshes like in Grice Bay and produced maps of the high and low marsh zones. This bottom left corner is showing us a plot of where we've been able to estimate the marsh volume using all of those meter stick profiles. And then here's a map from Western Boundary Bay where we've combined our mapping with the vegetation surveys to get an idea of where we're seeing beach ridges, high marsh grasses, the just plain old high marsh, low marsh vegetation, and salt pans. And so it gives us a picture of these different types of areas so that we can better map what's happening with the carbon. Okay, so I'm going to present some of our results here, but I thought it would be useful just to summarize my main points first before I go through them individually. And the first is, so we've worked on seagrass systems primarily in Clayoquot Sound, and our key result here was that the carbon accumulation rates we've got in this system are 10 times lower than the global averages that are seen. Now, I qualify that with we are still seeing that the accumulation rates in those seagrass systems are higher than reference sites where we're looking at places that have no vegetation. So there is a benefit to having the seagrass system there. It's just our comparison with the global average, it shows that those systems are 10 times lower than these global averages. We see a similar pattern in the carbon stocks of the Pacific salt marshes. They are substantially lower than global averages, about a third to a half. But the carbon accumulation rates are comparable to other areas, on the Pacific coast of Canada, or Pacific coast of North America, and in eastern Canada, and in some places, in some estimates, even larger. Which brings me to my next point, which is that when we look within each system, the carbon dynamics can be highly variable. And so we found that characterizing each system requires careful and individual sampling to capture the variability. And our fourth point was that we've seen through our comparisons with global databases that our knowledge of the areal extent of these ecosystems is poor. And our global data sets that we compared with our field ground truth data are overestimating Pacific salt marsh areas by factors of this point one, the Pacific coast seagrass carbon accumulation rates are 5 to 10 times lower than the global average, but still greater than unvegetated control sites. So on the left side here, I'm showing a classic figure from McLeod et al. 2012, which was comparing the carbon burial rates in seagrass, mangrove, and salt marsh soils with soils from tropical forests, boreal forests, and temperate forests. Note that these are not net ecosystem productivity measurements, but soils. So I've circled the boreal forests and the seagrass estimates for the global and boreal forests and moved them over and put them in the right graph, the graph on the right side, to show a comparison between the boreal forests and areas where I've been able to calculate carbon accumulation rates. So the first orange bar is showing our estimates for Clayoquot Sound, which are on the order of 10 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. And so as you can see, this is about an order of magnitude smaller than that global average. When we consider the whole of BC, that number gets a little bit larger. And if we consider seagrass beds further south in the state of Washington, they're a little bit higher, although probably within the uncertainty of what we've measured here. But essentially the point is that what we're seeing on the Pacific coast is quite different from what's in the global average. And that's not necessarily surprising when you consider these ecosystems that we're looking at. First of all, the species composition between the Pacific coast marshes and a typical subtropical marsh is quite different. So I've got a picture here of the Zostera marina, which is from the Pacific coast, and compared it with a seagrass species from Tampa Bay, Florida. And one of the first things you can see is the difference in the rooting systems. So it's not entirely surprising that these shallower rooting system seagrasses are holding less carbon. And in fact, when we compared our measurements with other measurements globally, we found that the above ground biomass in Zostera marina that we sampled was actually 2 to 4 times higher than the below ground biomass. And this is exactly the opposite in other seagrass species from tropical areas, where the below ground biomass is 2 times higher than the above ground biomass. So this is, that rooting system could be playing a very important role in why the Pacific coast ecosystems have less carbon in them. We also suspect that we're seeing lower productivity, largely because of less light and a lower nitrogen content in the area that we're located. And also, the area around Tofino has negative sea level rise, and it's possible that that's contributing to a limitation on the accumulation of carbon over time. And I'm going to talk about that a little more when I talk about the salt marshes next. So the second point, this is a figure from Chastain et al. 2022, is that although the carbon stocks in the Pacific marshes are lower than the global averages, the carbon accumulation rates actually are comparable to other areas along the Pacific coast of North America and Eastern Canada. So on the left side, the open circles here and triangles, these are just 2 different ways we have of quantifying the carbon accumulation rates. But the open circles are from Clayoquot Sound, and then the filled symbols are all representing averages. So the averages for BC, you can see here's Boundary Bay and Clayoquot Sound. And then as we go from Washington, Oregon, and California, we see these carbon accumulation rates getting a bit lower. And in terms of comparison with here's the North Pacific average, we have an IPC global average for carbon accumulation rates. And these two estimates for the Northwest Atlantic and global are from a different publication. I should have pointed out that all of these other numbers are constrained by lead 210 dates, and the two on the right are actually incorporating other dating mechanisms that may be inflating those values. But nevertheless, the main point is that those carbon accumulation rates aren't lower than the global average. In fact, they're comparable and maybe even higher. So why then are the carbon stocks so low? Basically, what we've been seeing is that the marshes that we've investigated are young and shallow. But anyway, so the marshes are shallow. As I mentioned before, we get to the base of the peat layer by between 20 and 50 centimeters, whereas the global standard is to try and estimate them down to a meter. But we actually are reaching sand well before we reach that, before we get to a meter. And they're quite young. Some of them are 30 years old. I guess the maximum we've gotten is around 100 years old, but the marshes that we're sampling tend to be quite young. And one of the things we think is really driving this are probably the tectonic conditions, where in the areas where we're seeing negative sea level rise, that limitation on sea level rise is reducing the vertical accretion of the marshes in this area, and therefore reducing the carbon accumulation rate. And I should point out that this is a very different picture than what's happening on the east coast of Canada. We're currently working with Gail Chimura, who does an extensive amount of work in Atlantic Canada, and she came and looked at our marshes, and her jaw dropped because of how different they are in character, which kind of leads me to my next point, which is that the carbon dynamics are highly variable within each system, and the characterization requires careful sampling to capture this variability. So I'm providing two examples here showing the differences that we get just from looking at the high versus the low marsh zones in these areas. We see much higher, well, not much higher, but we see higher organic carbon content in the high marsh versus the low marsh, and quite different carbon stocks. This is for Western Boundary Bay, and the one on the figure on the right over here is showing us the carbon stocks measured down to a 30-year age horizon, which emphasizes how huge that difference is between the carbon stocks over 30 years in the high versus the low marsh. So we see that, I should point out actually that a lot of the marshes measured on the east coast of North America, or ones around Massachusetts, are showing the opposite pattern, where they're seeing more carbon accumulation in the low marsh zones rather than the high marsh zones. So really the area in which you're studying can influence the conclusions you draw. We also see this when we start to look at the history of the marsh over time. We were fortunate in Boundary Bay to have aerial photographs from 1930. And so we were able to compare look at how the marsh has changed over the last 90 years. And interestingly, what we saw was that the marsh is certainly expanding in the western part of Boundary Bay. So this blue line, light blue line, is showing you the present day extent of the marsh superimposed on this aerial photograph. This yellow line here is showing the presence of the dike. And so Western Boundary Bay has actually seen an expansion of 26 hectares, which is about a 20% expansion of that marsh. Whereas in contrast, in the Eastern Boundary Bay, that marsh has seen a 35% reduction in size. So an 18 hectare reduction in the size there. I should point out that we think a lot of this may be related to the expansion of the highway system, which was put in place in the 1940s, which probably had a huge impact on the extent of this marsh. But anyway, historical changes have an influence on those marshes. And so for monitoring your carbon, it's useful to have some sense of the history of the change in the marsh. But I'd like to move on to my fourth point now, which is essentially that our knowledge of the aerial extent remains poor. And we decided to look at this in more detail within the Pacific salt marshes, specifically Cypress Flats, Grice Bay, and Boundary Bay. And the punchline here is that when we compared our field collected data with the global data sets, we found that the global data sets were overestimating the size of the marsh areas by factors of 2 to 5. So we compared 3 different data sets, our local data set put together by Hassini, the United Nations Environment Program dataset, which is the one that's used most extensively in global assessments, and a new dataset put together by the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, which employs some shore zone information, and where there are data gaps, they use the UNEP dataset to fill those gaps. So in some places, there are quite large similarities between UNEP and the CEC data, but not always. So first we did this for Boundary Bay, and what I'm showing you is the reconstruction of the location of the marshes in Hassini's work, her estimates of the high and low marsh, the UNEP data set, and then the CEC data set. And basically what you see is Hassini has very carefully tried to follow the actual presence of where the marsh is located, ground truth by the field data. UNEP is using more of sort of a line, a buffered line that takes the marsh size then up to the coastline. And then the CEC wound up incorporating some extensive sandbars and mudflats in theirs. And in fact, their polygons extend actually onto the land in this. And this can result in a huge difference in the estimate of the size of the marsh. While Hassini estimated the marsh was 222 hectares, UNEP is slightly larger at 330, but the CEC dataset is at 1,207 hectares. So we see similar patterns in the other two sites. At Cypress River Flats, Hassini estimated at 25 hectares, UNEP at 57, and the CEC, which is covering, including all of these mudflats, put it in at 84 hectares. And finally, the same is seen in Grice Bay, where Hassini's got an estimate of 55 hectares. The UNEP and the CEC data sets, which are essentially the same from UNEP, are at 244 hectares. So substantially larger estimates of where those marshes are present. Now, as you might imagine, this actually has quite an impact on our estimates of both carbon storage and annual carbon accumulation rates. So the top panels are showing the carbon stocks estimated from these data sets, and the bottom is showing the carbon accumulation rates we've estimated using our carbon accumulation rate data and upscaling. And essentially, Hassini's values are in yellow and red, delineating the high and low marsh, and then the UNEP and CEC values are in blue. And naturally, if they're overestimating the area by 2 to 5 times, they're overestimating the carbon mitigation potential of the salt marsh by 2 to 5 times as well. So this has some large implications regarding how we consider blue carbon ecosystems as within effective climate policy. Essentially, we have existing estimates of the area of the marsh, but our experience on the Pacific coast is that we need to be looking more closely at the reliability of those estimates. Now, it's fair to say that when we look in some of these existing data sets here, one thing that we see is that we see a twofold overestimation in some places, but in some places the marshes are actually missing from the data set. This is not an easy task to put together this type of information. But we're also looking at a situation globally where we know there is already a 20-fold uncertainty in the area. And so for us to be informing effective climate policy, we need to have a better handle on the areal extent of these marshes. So I gave you 4 points, but I want to touch on some of our future work. And that is, we have focused up to this point at looking at the carbon stocks, the carbon accumulation rates, and the areal extent of specific marshes. But really, for that holistic understanding of the carbon budgets, we need to include an understanding of the greenhouse gas emissions and better quantify in situ and ex situ carbon contributions. In other words, what is actually being produced locally in the marsh autochthonously, and what is being transported in from outside sources. Because the point for climate mitigation is that we actually want to count carbon that's actually being removed from the atmosphere, not carbon that's been counted somewhere else and then moved into our ecosystem and just stored here. If that carbon's already been counted and we're counting it twice, we're doing nothing to help with climate change mitigation. So right now we're working on using some tracers to see within these ecosystems how much of that carbon we think is actually produced locally and how much is brought in from elsewhere. So in terms of understanding our greenhouse gas budgets a little bit better, we've teamed with Sarah Knox at the University of British Columbia, who's put up a flux tower in Boundary Bay. And we are in the process of measuring some greenhouse gas emission uptake and release using some new equipment we've purchased through Parks Canada. And with that, we're also trying to measure associated marsh salinity and nutrient inputs so that we can get a handle on what that full greenhouse gas budget is. We're also, as I just mentioned, we're working to understand some of the carbon input and output from other sources. Already at the start in our marshes, we are seeing little bits of wood chips in some of our sediment cores. Now, our initial efforts have involved removing those wood chips from our cores so that we're not counting wood from outside as part of the carbon that's actually being stored by the seagrass or the salt marsh vegetation in the sediments. But I think this work needs quite a bit more work for us to make sure that we're not double counting this carbon. And then finally, part of what we're doing is expanding our coverage across Canada. I'm looking at those stars right now and realizing that our sites are on this map currently are sitting in Alberta. And I think that there was an overlay problem. Those brownish stars are actually ongoing work along the coast, and we're not actually measuring blue carbon way off in the Atlantic Ocean. Those should actually be closer to the coastline of Nova Scotia there. But essentially, the point is that we have several sites working closely with Parks Canada to try and expand what we're doing on the Pacific Coast and expand our comparison with parks on the Atlantic Coast as well. So I'd like to conclude now by essentially saying that blue carbon potential is very important. I think for us to be getting back to this question of addressing net zero, we're going to have to pull out all the stops. We need to be looking at all of these different mechanisms and different ways of addressing climate change mitigation. But at the same time, the devil is in the details. We do need to look closely, and we need to take off rose-colored glasses and make sure that we are focusing on how we can use these marshes and seagrass beds in a way that we're actually helping with climate change mitigation. So rather than reread all of the things that I've just said here, I'm going to go to my thank you slide. And thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you, Karen, for that terrific presentation. And you've certainly opened our eyes to the challenges of understanding carbon dynamics in both the eelgrass beds and seagrass beds and in the coastal marshes here on the west coast of Canada, and how important that is if we're going to be thinking about using these ecosystems for thinking about carbon credits or carbon sequestration over both short and longer time frames. Clearly, the amount of work you've done is huge and really important in providing this insight. We have a few questions in the chat and in the Q&A. And one of the questions is, given the changing chemistry of the oceans due to climate change, including ocean acidification, of which you've done some work on yourself, how do you anticipate that this might affect the salt marsh function and thereby the carbon sequestration potential?
That's a fantastic question, and one that I have done a limited amount of exploring in the literature. And my limited amount of exploration showed me that it's complicated and it's not the same answer everywhere you look. And unfortunately, I can't answer the question more than that, but it is definitely something worth looking into. I think probably more for seagrass beds than for the salt marsh ecosystems. When you start to get into the salt marsh, I think that the current variability from just the diel variability in terms of the amount of salt that comes in and the evaporation and the freshwater inputs make it a highly variable system to begin with. And so my guess, and this is just a guess, is that the acidification itself is probably due to ocean acidification from the influx of carbon dioxide is going to be a small component relative to some of the other changes that we're putting upon salt marshes. Like the area of Boundary Bay, for example, is right downstream from agricultural lands. And so the nutrient influxes from those agricultural lands, my guess is going to be a type of anthropogenic influence that's probably stronger than ocean acidification.
Okay, so thank you. We have a follow-up question in a sense, and I'll add a little bit to myself of my thoughts on this one in terms of the question. The question is, do you have thoughts on the permanence of marsh carbon stocks as the climate and ocean change? And I would add to that a little bit of, on the east coast of the US and some of the salt marsh work that's been done, they've been looking at the CO2 fertilization effects, from increasing CO2 in the atmosphere on
Right.
salt marsh production. And at the same time, the effects of increasing temperatures as well, which increases organic matter decomposition. And then, of course, the sea level rise on top of that. And one of the things they found on the East Coast was of actually a decrease in the amount of carbon stored in the marsh sediments because of the interactions of those factors. Do you have any insight into what you might expect here on the west coast of Canada due to various climate changes?
Okay, I'd like to put an aside before I address the climate one, and which is that I suspect that it's the human influence and human development, and that is probably going to be one of the largest issues with permanence in these marshes, is that unless they are actually set aside, conserved, or restored, that the human activities that are actually denuding, that are causing them to degrade, is probably a very large factor. But that wasn't the question. The question was related to climate change. So I've just been looking into this in terms of what the actual sea level rise impacts are on the Pacific coast compared to the Atlantic coast. And in our marshes, one of the things that we're seeing is we're not actually seeing the impacts of the 3.1 or 3.2 millimeter per year of sea level rise. That's dampened quite a bit in a lot of the areas where we're seeing these marshes. And so assuming none of these other things that I've just talked about in terms of the human interactions are not in place, they're actually in a good position to maintain those carbon accumulation rates. Sybil, now you were bringing up the points about how temperature could affect these, affect the marshes as well. I know less about how that happens. It's certainly something that needs to be looked into. And one of the things that I think is really important in any nature-based climate solution is monitoring of that carbon, because permanent, I mean, even if we're getting a temporary, a temporary increase in carbon sequestration helps us a little bit for a while. Understanding the permanence of that carbon really does take long-term monitoring. So, and it's the permanence that we really need overall. However, I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater by not using a temporary sequestration, because it will help us in the short term.
Great, thanks for that. Lots of other questions here in the chat and in the Q&A. I'll just take one here, which is, can you please speak to how policy solutions might differ if we knew more details about carbon dynamics in these salt marshes, and compared to if we only had the current information that we have? So in other words, if we knew more, how might that affect the policy solutions that we might offer?
Right. I have a lot of different answers for this. The first of which is that I have tried to work with Metro Vancouver and with the city of Vancouver, and I actually still am working with Metro Vancouver because they want to collaborate more to learn more about their blue carbon ecosystems so that they have the potential to use them. And so there's certainly a place for us to be making sure that information is communicated, especially I think on the smaller scale levels, because that's where the management of these is going to have, these ecosystems has to be. So that's kind of one comment. The second comment is that you bring up an interesting point with this question, because when you start to implement nature-based climate solutions, a lot of marshes, the carbon in a lot of marshes in Canada can't actually even be considered for those policies, because there are already sort of net zero you can't actually go in, you're not supposed to be destroying any marshes as is. So the policy baseline is that we can't actually, we can't destroy an existing marshland. And therefore, it's the baseline, the status quo is that we're conserving these marshes. And so for us to actually consider that carbon as a nature-based climate solution where we're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, we actually have to consider its additionality. Mm-hmm. And so in a lot of places, we can't even consider marshes because of those net zero policies in terms of destroying or keeping of marsh area. So there are places though where restoration actions could actually help with the storage of CO2. And again, I think that what I've done with Metro Vancouver and the City of Vancouver is I've gone through the list of those types of measurements that need to happen for you to be able to store them. The workshop that I was at, I had a carbon accounting person present who actually went through how strict this accounting needs to be for us to be able to do this. So I hope I'm not sidestepping your question.
No, I think it was I think that was, well, it wasn't my question, but it was the person that asked that. But I think it was a great answer. And I think you brought up a number of additional points that really are important to make there in terms of policies and if carbon credits, quote unquote, are going to be given for these regions, it has to be that additionality. That's really a very important point. Another question, which is about blue hydrogen. Okay, now blue hydrogen, and it took me a while to kind of get my head around this question, but let me read it to you. And maybe we can see if we can paraphrase it. Blue carbon and blue hydrogen are directly related and confusing. Blue carbon includes blue hydrogen. And using these terms leads to misunderstandings when blue carbon involves sequestering and blue hydrogen involves mining methane in the sea floor. Okay, so the idea I think this person is getting at is blue hydrogen refers basically to steam reforming. Sorry, I'm getting my words mixed up here, but basically using the hydrogen in methane to make hydrogen, using hydrogen atom in methane to make hydrogen gas. It's called blue hydrogen. And of course, if they're mining the hydrogen from the sea floor, it would be used then in making what would be called blue hydrogen. So let me start again. Blue carbon and blue hydrogen are directly related and confusing. Blue carbon includes blue hydrogen, and using these terms leads to misunderstandings when blue carbon involves sequestration and blue hydrogen involves mining methane in the sea floor, mainly in coastal environments. Can you comment on how your work with blue carbon is also helping us address the threat of accelerated global warming by disturbing blue hydrogen and impact on our policies to mitigate global warming? It's a little confusing, long question.
Yeah. I honestly don't know that much about blue hydrogen, so it is confusing to me. Especially, it depends on the depth over which the blue hydrogen is actually being mined. And my suspicion is if it's on the shelf, on continental shelf sediments, then we are connected in the sense that we're part of the continuum from the fresh water into the coastal waters into the open ocean. But
Let me ask a little bit different question, Karen, because I know this is a kind of a difficult one or a challenging one to address. Let me simplify this. What do we know about and it relates to another question being asked, which is, what do we know about the efflux of methane from these sediments?
right.
Is there
Okay, so
much?
thank you. I can actually address that one much more easily. So there are some meta-analyses that are suggesting that as we reach as we go into a salt marsh, we're getting into areas where the salinity increases the sulfate content, and it essentially shuts down methagenesis. And so the papers that we've looked at so far suggest that when you get into salinities that are less than 18 parts per million, you actually shut down a lot of the methagenesis. So sorry, I said that backwards. Salinity greater than 18 parts per thousand, that methagenesis is greatly reduced. And we even have seen this. There was a case study on the Atlantic coast in Massachusetts where there was a salt marsh that had been converted to a fresh marsh, essentially related to agriculture. And this marsh was now a freshwater marsh, had been for decades. And they rehabilitated the marsh and started to flood it. And they had flux towers or flux measurements that we're making over this marsh. And they saw that methane dropped to zero rapidly. So essentially, one of the things that we're trying to do in this is look at the salinity of these marshes to try and the seasonal cycle of the salinity of these marshes to see what that process is. What's the link between when methane is being produced and when it's being stored? So in a place like Boundary Bay, where the surrounding waters have a high enough salinity, we suspect that most parts of that marsh are actually not producing methane. That said, it's more complicated than how I've just presented it. So, and so that's part of why we're trying to go in and make sure that this one meta-analysis we've seen that used mostly marshes from the East Coast of the United States and the East Coast of Canada actually is reflective of what we're seeing on the Pacific Coast.
Great. Okay, Karen, thank you. I have another question. I think we have time for this last question here. Maybe another one. Let's see. A related question might be, can we think of coastal ecosystem restoration as somehow being the marine parallel of reforestation on land? Yeah. And if so, how would the carbon sequestration potential of the two compare?
We have talked about this at the CCA panel, at the Council for Canadian Academics panel. Again, it's always more complicated, and I haven't really thought this all the way through, but we have talked about sort of like marshation, right? Adding marshes where there were not marshes previously. Well, first of all, it's likely that there were a lot of marshes. We don't even know how many marshes we've lost in BC, for example, due to development. So there are a lot of places where you would where it would be possible probably to bring in marshes again. There are also going to be areas, just like with afforestation, where it's not a good idea because the ocean dynamics are such that the marsh may not even grow there. So I'm hesitant to go to a picture, but I'm going to try and do it. I think it's right up here. So in the center of this picture is Boundary Bay, and you can see the West Marsh and the Eastern Marsh here. This area in the middle has some tiny bit of marsh, but essentially it's all eroded away. And you can see the erosion happening on this part of the more central eastern part as well. And it essentially, I'm skeptical that marsh would actually grow there simply because of the ocean dynamics. So it would require looking closely at the oceanographic conditions to see if it's possible.
Right. And also what the longevity of that would be,
yes,
as you pointed out. Right. Well, I think we've come to the end of our time, Karen. I want to thank you absolutely for a terrific presentation. and really opening our eyes to the dynamics and the challenges and the potential here for carbon storage, carbon dynamics in the west coast of Canada. Really important work, and clearly a lot more still needs to be done. I would also like to thank the audience for their participation, great participation, and thank everyone for your questions. So with that, Karen, I think we'll close this session, and thank you again very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.